Hello everybody and welcome. Thank you so much for stopping by. Remember, if you're new to the channel, hit that like and subscribe button. It really helps in growing the channel so we can continue to bring you educational chess content. Let's go. Now, a rook endgame that tends to appear quite a lot in practice is when the defending king is cut off from the attacking pawn by the rook, kind of like what we see here, okay? So whether or not this position is a draw or a win for the attacking side is going to depend on the placement of the pieces. Now, there are some rules that apply to positions like these. I'm going to read through the notes really quickly, and then we'll go through this position and see how this is played, okay? So it states, the rules for playing positions with the defending king cut off go as follows. When we have a pawn on the third or fourth rank, and the king is nearby, kind of like what we have here, okay? We win if and only if the defending king is cut off by at least 3 files from a B or a G pawn, meaning pawns on the knight files, B and G, or if they're cut off by 2 files from the central pawns, okay? Let's get all these arrows out of the way here. And then it goes on to state, if we have a pawn still on the second rank and the king on the fourth or fifth rank, the attacking side wins if and only if the enemy king is cut off from the pawn by 5 files. Kind of like the further back the pawn is and the farther away from the king, the more the defending king needs to be cut off in order to convert the point. Okay, now in this current position, white has their pawn on the B file and on the fourth rank. So if we go back here to the note, it says when it is on the B or the G files, meaning the knight files, okay? And the pawn is on the third or fourth rank, the king is nearby, the defending king needs to be cut off by 3 files, okay? Now, currently, if it were black to move, the black king could step in, meaning that there would only be 2 files between the pawn and the king. Okay, so knowing that, with white to move, the winning move in this position is rook to e1. Now, this is a very strong move. After this move, the black king is now cut off by 3 files. If it were black to move, however, they would draw by means of king e6, like we just mentioned, okay? So then why is this winning for white? So let's go through this position and see how exactly this is played, okay? So white just went with rook to e1. Black responds with king f5. The rook is kind of like in its ideal position, right? You want to pressure the pawn as much as possible. So really not a lot of moves here that you have left as the defending side. So king f5, king c4 with the idea that, yes, we're going to start pushing everything forward. And we don't have to worry about the king joining in because the king is currently cut off by the white rook here on e1. Okay, so after king c4, we have rook to c8 check, king to d5, rook b8. And now a very, very strong move. So the king is already cut off by 3 squares. We have rook to b1. Now the rook abandons its duties of cutting off the enemy king and rushes to defend the pawn. Even though the defending king is no longer cut off, the damage is already done since the king is much too far. So let's see, after rook b1, black responds with king to f6, and then the mission here is just to push the pawn forward as far as you can. Okay, so you go b5, king to e7, and then a very strong move here, king c6. And here in this position, black has several tries. So the main one being king to d8, and then we'll go back to this position in just a bit to see other attempts because this loses immediately. Okay, so we have king d8. The pawn goes forward with b6, king to c8, and now a very strong move, rook to h1. Now the point of this move is essentially black is in zugzwang. There is no good move here, okay? So if you move the king to the only square available here, rook d8, you have rook h8 check. Who is sponsoring the rook? This is a free rook, okay? And then if you go with rook a8, which is the only other legal move, then as amazing as b7 check would be, you have checkmate. So yeah, that's not gonna work for black. Okay, so after this position, after rook h1, black is completely in soup swung. Okay, so let's go back a little bit and see. We were at rook. After king c6, we were at king d8. So here we see quickly how black loses after king d8. We have b6, king c8, and rook h1, right? So what happens if black attempts something else after king c6? Well, for instance, you could try rook c8 check, and the win here is very straightforward. You have king to b7. Now the rook drops to c2. And very instructive move here, very strong move. Rook to d1. Once again, I'm actually going to annotate this. This is a very good move. Rook to d1, once again cutting off the king, and we're going to very shortly see a position that should be very familiar to us already. So the rook comes into b2, pawn advances to b6, rook to b3. Basically, you don't have a lot left other than maintaining the rook on the b file, because we're going to see this little maneuver here, which should already also be familiar to us. Rook to a3, king to b8, rook b3, b7. And we have here the Lucena position. Rook to d4, rook b1, and then the king just steps away. And rook d4, instrumental in creating this bridge, blocking the rook from delivering any more checks, and we're going to be queening on the very next move. Now this position is so winning, and again, because the pawn is on one of the knight files and the defending side is running out of real estate to the short side, we could also create this bridge. Instead of rook d4, we have rook e1. But it's always best to just keep to the method that we know is winning. But rook e1 is also a very straightforward victory, because the king is just going to step to the side and queen on the very next move, and this king is way, way too far to do anything about it. Okay, so king c6, so that's if rook c8 check. And if you go rook h8, it's the same idea, right? You're going to try and check from the side, but the king is way too far. The pawn is too advanced, and the king is too close to it, so there's not much you could do. King c7, what a fantastic move, right? Shielding yourself from the checks with the defending king. So the rook comes down to h2 with the idea is that we're going to try and check from behind now, but you're just way too late. Rook e1, again, what a phenomenal move, right? We're going to annotate this one again as a good move. What a great move, forcing the king to step away, and now we continue with our winning maneuver. And once again, this is a winning Lucena position. Now the reason that it's important to know that when we're on the B and G files, right, that you could also create the bridge to either the A or the H files is because, for example, in this position, black has king to f5. Now, ideally, you would love to bring your rook to the fourth rank, right, and create that bridge once again from the checks. You can't play rook e4 in this position, so you're forced to go rook to a1. And same plan, the king is just going to step to the side to a8 and push the pawn forward to b8, okay? So that's why after king c6, your best attempt really is to go king to d8. Now I want to go forward just a few moves here, just one move actually. In this position we saw after king to c8, the winning move, rook h1, black is in zugzwang. No good moves at his disposal, right? So what if we don't go king c8? What if we try some other things? Well, there are some moves that black can try. They're all losing. So for example, the first attempt here would be rook to c8 check. You have king b7, and the rook steps back, trying to put pressure on the attacking side from behind. Doesn't quite work. Rook d1 check. Again, this idea, giving a check, forcing the king to step further away, and now the key move, rook to d4, bringing that rook over to the fourth rank, once again creating the bridge, and now the rook is going to defend from the checks once the king and the pawn make it to b8 and b7 respectively. So rook b2, king to a7, check, and this position should already be very, very familiar to us, right? So rook c8 is immediately losing. Rook a8 is the other attempt. Basically, the defending side doesn't have a lot of legal moves here. So rook a8, b7 kind of runs into the same thing. Look at this amazing move. king to d6, right? So basically you're in Susong once again. The rook can't move because if the rook moves, I'm just going to capture it with the pawn. The only legal move here really is king to e8, and after king to e8, the king steps into c7, and we're going to be queening the next move, okay? And then finally, the last move that black can attempt here in this position is king to e7, but the win is very straightforward here for white, and it's actually transposed to a position that we just saw. So after b7, now the rook can't step away because we're just going to push the pawn and queen, okay? So we have pawn to b7, the king comes into d8, and then we see the winning maneuver once again, forcing black into Suswang. King to d6, king to e8, and then the king steps into c7. So as we can see from this beginning position, after rook e1, after we make sure that the king is cut off, the king is just way too far in order for the defending side to try to set up any sort of a defensive position where they can achieve the draw. And as always, if you have any comments, questions, or concerns, I'd love to hear from you in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.